Welcome to Pay Attention, interviews about.
Hello, this is Paula Young-Eisendrath here, and I'm here with my dear friend and longtime colleague, Pamela Williams. Pam Williams is a clinical social worker. She's an educator, and she has a great deal of experience in presenting at national conferences on BIPOC issues and DEI issues. She has presented especially at conferences for independent schools and also BIPOC issues for girls of color in regard to affinity groups. Pam has also, and I know her well through this, taught and worked with mindfulness in response to the issues of self and leadership in a DEI context, in a DEI space. And so she's one of the people that I would turn to in working with issues of kindness and compassion in the space of DEI, in applying particularly mindfulness. Now, naturally, in working with Real Dialogue, we attempt to create an environment in which there is a lowering of the emotional threat level so that people are able to respond to each other in terms of seeing each other as separate, humanized people, individuals. So I'm going to be talking to Pam today about the applications of Real Dialogue. She is a Real Dialogue specialist in the environment of DEI as it exists, especially in educational environments. But also we might talk to some extent about mindfulness environments when people are teaching in a mindfulness context. So welcome, Pam. So I would like first for you to tell me you finished the training in Real Dialogue. You're in the process of possibly becoming a trainer. I hope you will. But I'd like you to tell me how you understand Real Dialogue in its applications in a diversity, equity, and inclusion environment. How do you see those applications?
Right. Well, one of the areas I think is very core, and I'm going to use this word because this will come up again in some of the other environments that I'm involved in, which include core beliefs and how we approach core beliefs, things in our own experience that guide our values and our action, and how we need to have different processes at times to be open and curious as the times change and change the ground that we may know and confirm that we know things. And then in interaction with others, we find that the things that have been true for our stories and have been successful, suddenly there are questions about why that isn't working. And there's also a sense of personal disconnection, but also perhaps someone has, or a situation has come to you where another person is not seeing what you are trying to do in joining with them.
So for example,
or create a situation.
So for example, in regard to thinking of yourself as a kind person or a person who is compassionate and leads with compassion and kindness, that can really be thrown in an environment in which you're meeting people who have a very different background, who look different from you, and may also not see you at all in the way you see yourself. Is that what you're talking about, what your core beliefs
Yes.
are, about your core values?
Yes.
And so can you give an example of something that either you or you've seen someone else experience in, in a DEI or a BIPOC environment, in a mindfulness environment or an educational environment, can be any of these, where there is a situation where someone is sort of thrown off their, I guess, sometimes it can be thrown off your self-image. There can be what's called like white fragility, where people feel like, wow, I'm being seen here in some way that I don't see myself. Like I'm being seen as somebody who, is not being kind or compassionate. I don't know if we want to go, in that direction or in another direction, but can you give us some examples and we'll talk about those?
Well, yes, I think one of the things now, many educational organizations, whether they are at the K-12 level or higher education, often have mission-driven values. And currently, DEI is often very core to having an inclusive environment. It leads to the formation of strategic plans to change fundamental ways that we create structures to make that. Mm-hmm. And although people often agree on the core beliefs, they may not have had the lived experience or the recognition that to enact this, we have all been taught through a lens, often at least in the United States, of oppression, of bias, that without some way of interrupting and looking at that, we can make plans that increase harms or leave people out, or often seem, for somebody in a leadership position, to be misperceived about taking the full responsibility for the actions of plans that are being put forward.
So I think if, I am understanding you very much to be saying there's some strong ideals. Those ideals are driving a lot of the DEI plans, particularly now in a lot of educational environments. They are plans, maybe they're mandated, there are programs in place, people want to create transferable skills, etc. But there isn't really an understanding of how difficult this might be for the actual people going through it, and where there may be complete lack of experience of people being able to handle conversations and environments in the way that the ideals or the core values would want them to go, something like that.
Yes, very much. And I was in the midst, even as a participant recently, in a training that was put forward where someone was coming from out of the area. And what they did at one point is have the group shift to breaking up into affinity groups.
Yeah.
Well, what happened is at the point that they did this, they were unaware of the numerical imbalance.
Mm.
It meant that perhaps out of several hundred people, breaking into global majority affinity groups resulted in maybe 8 people.
8 people in one group, and then
the rest being
the other group.
Yeah. Well, yeah. But what that does is say, well, who and the direction of this training is that for? And does this further create a situation where there can be understanding of each other's experience in a format where there is gross discrepancy of the numbers of those that have affinity?
Right.
Well, you see, because people say in the United States that present mainly as predominantly Caucasian presenting are usually in affinity all of the time.
Mm.
And so when you shift that and say, all right, we're going to have affinity spaces for the global majority people, but if they have to leave the space or in a small corner of the room, it reinforces, for instance, maybe a view that now the gap is even further
Right.
to here, or people are more conscious of the fact that they don't know how each other can really be heard. Do you preserve the space for those who are global majority people who may not even know each other very well?
Right.
And then how do you coach them in the midst of this? And then what does this do when you want to bring the experiences together for people to hear? And people may be more conscious or self-conscious of having to, quote, be the spokesperson or that, and yet if there's a large number of people who are still mirroring the dominant racial group who may perceive to have a power base that the other global majority people do not have, then you have to have a way to work for that. And if you're not prepared, or you don't know how that was going to arise, then these are the skills that you have to come with. And there are some aspects of real dialogue, even though it is designed to be a much longer process, for instance, in the therapeutic application, that can be really used on the spot to help with coming forward in an authentic way and being vulnerable about talking about what was unexpected in this moment of arising, so that everyone can share in that experience. And that is something that we talk about, the skill of activation, and managing that is a skill in real dialogue that's very valuable.
So I want to make sure that we do, that we do sort this out, that real dialogue as a skill is an end user skill. It's a self-improvement skill, speaking for yourself, listening mindfully, then remaining curious. These are skills that you can use anywhere, and you would want to use them when there is a difficult conversation, because that's when you need to slow it down, give those pauses, then begin to take responsibility for the way you're speaking, the way you're listening. However, that's the skill. The method is this structured conversation that is co-facilitated, and that's a more formal process if we're setting up a difficult conversation to take place in a group where there are two people who are going to be facilitated by two other people to have a conversation about, for example, if there were two people on different sides of the issue of how this type of environment that you were talking about, with a majority Caucasian group and a minority BIPOC group, there might be some way to have a conversation that would be a negotiation, or what should we do? But that's a structured real dialogue method, of having a difficult conversation, using the skills, which I think is what you're going to be talking about, using real dialogue skills on the spot. You begin to speak for yourself, and then that needs to be paraphrased by somebody who's listening. And if they're not listening, then you need to be able to use the skills yourself. But I like the way you're introducing this from the perspective of saying, okay, here was a group environment with about 100 people, and your facilitator was coming from somewhere else, did not know what the group was like, but had set up in advance the idea of affinity groups that would then report back to the main group. And so there was probably confusion about what was happening, and there might also be other things that happened. So tell us about how, you used real dialogue on the spot, the skill, or how you would think it could be used, or, I don't know where you want to go with that, but.
Well, one of the things there is the skill of then being able to suggest to the trainer, because in this situation, basically what happened is the people in the global majority affinity group met with the trainer because he was needing to figure out the needs for the day, but also what might go on in the future. And so what happens here is, even though the training is being led by someone else, coming forward, again, remaining curious and mindful, while you might be triggered, or like I say, activated by a reoccurrence of disconnection or failures within the organization, where you might feel, okay, somebody else has to fix this, or it's not my responsibility, or this is just what always happens.
Yes.
When we've had these before, it's not going to be successful in the future. It's not going to change anything. It's just going to make it more difficult. So, the skills of real dialogue, because when you're taking this on, if you are then slightly reversing or unblocking yourself from these experiences, which can be authentic, but the curiosity here is, how did this arise? How do I also know some experiences that are similar where I can shift? Can I then shift into that? And how can I also listen to those around me? So I am not only just speaking from my past experience, there's an interdependence here for making this situation fresh and new for possibilities, because this will be important if, let's say, the suggestion would be to then speak and you want to accept that, even if another trainer is present. I mean, and this is very similar to the setup for having a real dialogue conversation, but there's a responsibility as a participant to listen mindfully, be curious, reframe, ask questions. Is there more? Am I hearing this correctly?
Right.
And these are very important skills as a participant, because you are then, they'll have the ability to shift an organizational experience that perhaps wasn't going well by bringing your fresh, mindful framework and experience even to a situation where you're not directly the trainer, but you see yourself as leading in creating a shift.
Yes, and the thing is that with mindful listening, you know, the person reflects back, this is the way I'm understanding this. Did I get it? And then is there more? Then allows you to engage in something that might be different than what you imagined you heard. I know for myself, many times when I'm in an environment where I'm working as a facilitator, I will stop and work with the person who is my person that I'm facilitating and ask them, what did you hear the other person saying? Many times, that's where we make a big mistake. We hear something, we're listening to our own, talk inside of our heads. Either the talk is saying something about the other person, or the talk might be saying something about ourselves, or it might be saying something about the situation we're in. So we're not listening accurately. And real dialogue opens up the possibility of saying to the other person, if you're using the skills, here's what I'm understanding. Did I get it? And I know myself, sometimes when I'm in a situation where there is difficult conversation going on and I feel emotionally triggered myself, I want to step forward and say, here's what I'm understanding. Did I get it? And sometimes I have to say to the other person, I need to check with you now. If you say more, I won't be able to remember it. So I need to stop you now and check with you. Here's what I'm understanding. Did I get it? Yes or no? Then elaborate. Is there more? That creates an environment that's kind of naturally, I guess I would say, kind, in the sense that you're paying close attention to the other person, no matter how they're affecting you emotionally. And then it becomes interesting and involves engaging curiosity when you start to realize that you haven't heard, or you didn't know, or you haven't seen. And I know you've had these kinds of environments, come up for you where people haven't heard what you've said, or they didn't take you into account in terms of what your role was. And I don't know if you'd like to speak about any of that, or if you want, maybe you had an experience in the event that you're talking about. But any example that you could give of your own speaking for yourself, listening mindfully, remaining curious.
Yeah, well, yes. And I think the important thing here is when we get back to the issue of the endpoint of compassion and building trust, the authenticity here, there is a balance between being responsible, but also conveying not only the emotion like I feel this, but there is a tone of feeling connected and heard, even if there are other things that need to be done in resolution. So it's very important to get to that point. And this is something, like I say, it's an interesting point when we get to the mindfulness aspect of this, because there's a point of being aware and sitting with something fairly quickly. And then again, what this question that I have is, what is the process for making space to interrupt action when there are negative patterns being created?
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes for oneself, like, this is why I say the leadership aspect is important here, because arising to that moment will often be helpful. It also takes practice, but in general, what it will also do is at least relieve yourself of the feeling that someone else is putting a context around you.
Mhm.
Even if it seems that they are not articulating it, the fact that you have spoken it into the space in a way that recognizes what your experience is, you also then can move away from that, and it should be something that can be noted to be able to come back to for yourself. I mean, and this is, it's kind of like a muscle memory. It is strengthened. And this is why we say that this is a praxis, and it has aspects and steps, so that you also know what you can come back to in other situations where there seem to be failures, and then see that there can be a success because you are actually stating something that the context does not always know about. And if we think about this, this is the issue with DEI. If you ask most people in the world right now, can we get to a place of interdependent understanding, given the fact that most structures that hold our lives have been designed inherently to elevate some, leave others, as I say, on their knees in some difficult circumstances, with the presumption that is making something better for everyone and something may come later for others. And I mean, when we talk about the spiritual aspects that also arise with dignity or things, how people overcome these come into it. But we have to see that this is an opportunity to move into a new space that no one really has had many experiences to know. We do have some though, and those usually have come through intimate experiences that we know before we have been able to ask questions about them. And so this is why I'm saying this issue of rising to the point where you can begin to ask questions. This is a very core point. People of color have not in the US predominantly been in position to even know what the questions are about certain processes, because those are hidden and kept away and made separate. And so just the very act of asking questions, it's just like the 6 questions in the beginning of the evaluation.
Yes. Right.
If you think about that, even if you were with somebody is in a position of leadership authority, to turn and say, may I ask you some questions about your assumptions about what you want that would demonstrate progress in this program that we are implementing.
So I want to stop you here just because I think this is a great point. And you're putting a spin on that first skill of speaking for yourself. You're saying, okay, speaking for yourself, the way that it's guided is that you speak subjectively, you speak modestly, you speak about your own impressions, your own opinions, your own feelings, your own thoughts, your memories. This is my memory. I might not be accurate in my memory, but you're adding also that can be a space in which you recognize you ask a question. You ask the question that you're curious about. You can ask a question of a leader. You can ask the question of the person who's structuring the event. So, you mentioned the possibility of asking, so what would you like to see as the outcome of this event? What are your what's your sense of the problems here? So those are the kinds of questions we ask in the evaluation. What's the value of this relationship to you personally? What do you consider to be the problems? What are the benefits? And that can be put into a larger environment where you're asking the leader, the person who's structuring the event. I think that there are many people, and I don't want to generalize here, but I do believe that in general, it does tend to be North American educated white women who are afraid of conflict. They're afraid of saying something directly about what they think, what they want, asking a question, and that what this leads to is a disavowing of one's own responsibilities, that one doesn't take responsibility for asking the question or saying the thing that's on one's mind. So, having this kind of skill, you can begin to feel that it's not just somebody else's responsibility to speak up, but that anyone can speak into the space as long as they speak for themselves, subjectively. I statements, not we statements, not you statements, and then ask questions in a way that is a sincere and authentic question. I know many times when I go into a kind of DEI training space, it seems to me often that the ideals are very high, or let's say, goals are lofty, and that what may be left out is what's actually happening in the moment, what's going on with the people in the room. And this is where you're saying, encouraging people to speak for themselves and then to listen also, and paraphrase.
Yeah, and it is a training about interrupting by making space. And this is something that people also are a bit wary about. Now, if we talk about mindfulness coming into these environments, this is often, even in an educational environment where there has, again, been much written about mindfulness in education, both how it is useful for your own grounding while you're presencing in front of others, but also how it can let you understand how rapidly your goals, just by even wanting to transmit something that you want to teach people that is of benefit to them, creates a power imbalance and a separation, or at least we'll say that. And this is something that is very interesting about mindfulness. And, stating the recognition, it's kind of like writing. Some people think writing should be easy. It should come naturally to those. Those people are good writers, versus writing is often a skill that is difficult and challenging. And those who follow a pattern, and of course, with some support and recognition, continue to do it. And again, the recognition of the meaning of it and what has been put forward often unfolds. And this is, again, when we talk about resilience and confidence, this is the other part of the real dialogue skills that are also resulting here. And the other thing is, if we get to the clinical parts, and I'm going to mention the issue of projection here, because So much training now is also done online and virtually, and that has, or components of hybrid. And this is very important, as those are beneficial ways to continue training and connection. But there is a different articulation about that. And it's a very visual read initially, before people are actually, I mean, they are constructing something, and it is another skill to be aware while you are interacting in that, what is going on about the projections. And it's, you know, there's a duality here.
Also, the thing about visual, when you just point out, when you're online, the experiences that you're having are often visual and auditory, principally with the other people. You can feel their emotions somewhat, but you're watching, you're looking maybe at yourself, maybe at others, and then you're hearing. And so in those domains, unless you're very careful, projection is very easy. You're going to organize your projections based on how people look. And you're going to assume in some way that you know something about the person in the way that they look. And I think that when we're operating from the point of view of real dialogue, what we really are wanting to get to is some sort of authentic contact between people in a way that increases their interest in going forward, even through the conflict. You know, when I'm working with couples in therapy, what I find is typically the biggest obstacle to their trusting, the two people trusting each other, is that they feel that they've already heard everything the other person is going to say. So they don't really listen. There's no freshness to it. And it's all based on projection. It's the projection is, I already know what you're going to say. I know what you're about. I know what you're motivated by. And often it is very much based on the projector. The projector has had these feelings. The projector is reading the other person as being angry when the projector is angry, you know. So that whole issue of, I know who you are, I know what you're about, all of that has to be disrupted in order to get to authentic contact. And like you're saying, online, often it doesn't happen.
Well, the other side of that is time and a sense of disappointment.
Mm.
And see, this is where this judgment about what's a success and what's a failure comes into this. And this is why in the DEI situations, it is important to pay attention to what's leveraged about why people are engaging in the training and the level of autonomy they have to carry out something. And this is a little bit different, you know, in friendships or intimate relationships or how you build that. And yet, on the other hand, there's a part of that that comes in there also, because there are different cultural norms when we talk about these core values about the ability, say, of even couples to move together, whether they are the same race, multiracial, the levels of connection to other family ties that they may not feel as much choice about, depending. So, I mean, there are some very important parallels about that. And when we talk about projection, the choices of who are leaders and who does training when they stand up in front of an organization is very interesting, because sometimes what usually gets represented is, when people will choose, who presents, you will look at choices about gender, racial, perceived projection, and
Right.
how you are going to say and reveal certain things. And see, this is a very important learning experience, because there's only a certain amount of information you need to, again, we're going to come back to being compassionate and truth and having equity here. You want to be very clear if you're establishing those to say things along those lines. And then you will have to teach and assess either your audience or your group about the language that they can have, that they either know or don't know. And when people don't know things and feel that something is being called upon for them, and this often comes up with, racial issues, is that there's a sense that I'm now responsible for a system that I didn't really want to participate in this way, but it is true in the disequity here. I need to perhaps think and behave a bit differently, or how I feel comfortable about saying something. Or I need to be aware that even my body language or various other things, particularly if you're in education or you're in other roles, it isn't really your personal space. And there are some tools of communication that signal other responses, again, of disconnection, of choice, of leaving out another, even for something that is something you like more, feel more comfortable to. And then, because if there isn't an experience where you have lived as the, say in the US, the Caucasian majority, where you have had a lot of experiences where you're in the global majority, where you see that and are comfortable interacting within that and less self-conscious, well, most people, that is not something that has really happened yet in this period of time.
Well, for many, yes, for many people, I think,
And
who have,
then when you
yes.
are, and when you're either leading or teaching people how to enter that experience, where you're going to have to find other ways, and there are ways to do that. And when we come back to compassion, that ways of uncertainty, things of dignity, and how, for instance, people in the global majority have shifted to carry history much closer to the natural nature that is really afforded all of us, which we would really want to have. But it is often had to be hidden, it is often devalued. And yet that is a very strong value. And I mean, you see it now as we have immigrant populations coming across languages, making their way to define themselves, and maintain kind of the centrality of what they have had. We're seeing that these are the things that really are of value to everyone.
Right. I think that there's so many issues that, as you have articulated all the different levels, of difference that can come up between people and then can become a part of self-consciousness. So these self-conscious emotions also can disrupt our ease in trying to make contact. If we feel ashamed, if we feel humiliated in a group, like our status is lowered, if we feel envious or jealous or guilty, those emotions, when they come in, will tend to want us to protect ourselves or to promote ourselves. And I think that if we step back into like the idea of, can we relate in a way that is compassionate, that is kind, through these environments of change that we've never experienced. People have not experienced trying, in any way succeeding in an egalitarian environment where there is equity, where there is mutuality. That hasn't happened. It hasn't happened yet. We're trying to invent it now. So, if we can proceed in a way, that's why I like real dialogue in its simplicity. Speak for yourself, listen mindfully, remain curious. It sounds simple, but the fact is it's difficult to do it. And also I don't know how to say this, but a lot of DEI work does seem to assume that the way that a person looks has something to do with who they are. And so that if somebody comes like I do from a mixed racial background, I don't look like I come from a mixed racial background. But if you hear the history of my family, the fragmentation of it, everything that happened, you understand, and if you see the pictures of the people in my family, but you don't understand looking at me. So I know that people make assumptions. A lot of times I don't think it's worth explaining anything, but then that can create a kind of a gap for me, that when I know assumptions are being made, I don't know if I should address those assumptions. And I'm sure there are many people in the BIPOC sphere that feel that assumptions have been made based on how they look all the time, rather than, their actions. And I love the fact that the Buddha says, the only thing that really is your possession in the long run is your actions. It's not these other things. But in these environments in which people are trying to develop a new way of relating with greater equity, greater diversity, and so on, there are a lot of obstacles. But as you say, there are also a lot of possibilities if you're proceeding in a way that does allow everybody to enter into the conversation. There have to be structures, there have to be rules, but there also has to be open inquiry.
Well, and people also need to understand history and that they didn't know.
Yes.
I mean, this is in terms of curriculum, but it is also comes from their direct experience, again, of things they were told make for success. And when we get into we talk about, for instance, test taking and evaluation, which again, we have to look at this, because when we're looking at evaluation of, say, real dialogue, it's a skill, but there's a consciousness that people will bring, like that they want to feel successful about learning these tools.
Yes.
And we have to be aware of that and make space again for people to see what has shifted for them. And this is a very interesting thing, because silence can be an opener when people who are practiced with it. But many people feel silence means that is shutting me down. That is uncomfortable. I don't know what's going on. I don't have a roadmap. I don't like that. So, there are a lot of issues about, what isn't about, and sometimes again, having the facility of language to describe your own experience, even where it has been difficult to hear how somebody has projected towards you, it is ultimately helpful. And it also creates a way to form what I will say journeys that take people from place to place, because all of us are going to go to some places where we've never been before. I mean, I feel like it's sort of like the childhood story, but this is really true. And if we're also going to think about, I think also when we think about structures and why artistry, synchrony of mind and body is very, very important. We learn to signal when we are feeling a bit of more ease within ourselves. When you can know that, this also allows your mind to think of more possibilities, like even when you have to come up with more strategic possibilities or try to shift something in the environment, or say, I need some other information from people that I don't think has been given here yet. And
so you're saying also that the ease in the body is a way, it has to be encouraged in these environments where people are expected to speak for themselves and listen mindfully, in environments where there's an expectation that you're going to go on a new journey, that it's important to also to pay attention to what's going on physically and to help people be at greater ease, because that's when they can think of things that are a question for them, or the things that they want to express for themselves. And often I think that a mistake that we all make is that we assume that whatever we're experiencing, others are experiencing it also. Like if I'm comfortable with the room temperature, I just assume everybody's comfortable with the room temperature, but that might not be the case at all. Or if I'm uncomfortable, maybe I assume everybody else is comfortable, so I don't mention it. But that if I'm sitting there uncomfortable with whatever is going on and I haven't mentioned it because I assume everyone else is comfortable, then that's going to create a big gap for me. So there are just many subjective experiences that contribute to how people can move through a training or a teaching or any kind of activity in which the goal is change, development, transformation.
Yes, and seeing new possibilities of connection. Now, the other thing that I think that is important to mention here, when we're talking about the body, and I mentioned testing and evaluation, many of the judgments about what provides relief, definitely is designed by people who are generally more successful at moving through these tasks. But the other thing to be aware of, particularly if we look at like the development in medicine, for instance, much of the training, even now, is based on textbooks and representation that does not include the reactions of people of color at the cellular levels.
Mhm.
And see, this becomes the reason why you need to know these things for yourself, because you will have to tell into an environment that has not necessarily included you
Right.
or has misgrouped you. And yet, if you were thinking, I need to be compliant and do things because I need what is being offered.
Yes, yes. And I think, again, that issue about who's going to tell your story, who is narrating, who is in the codified books. Well, it's pretty clear who has been, and that doesn't include a lot of people who are the consumers of this medicine or this training or whatever, and so I think recognizing that your story and your condition and your body might not be included in the text or the code or whatever, it's important to know then to ask questions at, when you're in that environment. And as you said, if you are someone who needs the resources, you may feel that you cannot speak for yourself and ask the questions because that will interrupt your ability to get the services that you need.
Yeah, and the other piece is to get the recognition. And even whether it's acceptance from a partner or to, or, in the dominant world, if you are going to get the recognition, you may feel that you have to pattern yourself and absorb a certain number of things that are really negative to your condition. Well, see, but the issue there again is questioning and choice. Do you have the authentic ways to do that? And that also means constructing and hearkening back to what again has been your true nature of support. I mean, there are many people. I mean, I met someone just in traveling recently who we opened up a dialogue, and it was a woman of color, and we were talking about how it seems now with the disruption of COVID that it's important to talk to people sometimes if there just is a sense that this is a person to connect with. And particularly women, she said, particularly women of color. And she told a little bit about her experience that, she connected with a partner very early. It was an abusive relationship. It took her many years to work her way out of it. And then she got into something else that was more constricted. And she says, I'm finally now free. It took me 51 years to actually begin to experience what it is like to be, on my own. And see, this is a very interesting thing to consider. And this is why I say this issue of feeling empowered by leadership and separateness versus a supported separateness.
Yes, that's a very good distinction. Yes.
Yeah, and I think that this is what we talk about in terms of real dialogue. There is creating the space here, but it is a supported, resilient challenge there.
And
that
it's a supported
is strengthening.
It's a supported separateness, like you said, that the support is that you have the right to have your own experience, have your own questions. There's a way to speak it. There's a way to listen. There's a way to know and not know yourself. And that is a supported differentiation. It's not an isolated differentiation, and I know we have to come to an end because it's been about an hour. And so I know that there'll be some editing of this, but you've made incredibly, really important points. I wonder if there's something that you want to be sure that we include that you haven't said yet?
Well, one of the things I want to go to, which is this issue about opposing sides, that is a part of the construction of real dialogue. And particularly if we look at the larger backdrop of oppression, enslavement. And what I am aware of in thinking about this is that sometimes what comes up is even people of color in constructing their own support environments, there is a recognition of, like I say, a need for support that is contained, so you don't have to start from ground one trying to tell your experience. You hope that some people might be more familiar to it. However, when we look at whether or not then there is the opportunity to challenge the process, or when I say challenge, experience what the process of seeing somebody who is an oppressor as being in opposition, how that situation is constructed, even amongst people of affinity, is a very interesting aspect when we come back to that. And if you think about this, like I thought about this in terms of why I mentioned the body and a sense of ease, tension and release with mindfulness, or in the Buddhist sense, the 4 foundations of mindfulness, and the senses of this, because we're looking at what I would say are extreme levels of continued injustice that are uninterrupted. Mm-hmm. Now, at what point is that putting people on opposing sides versus a process? And I think this is a very interesting question when we look at the goals of real dialogue and how, again, we find language to have people come to understand how they mark those spots in that process.
The term opposing sides came about because there was a long conversation I was having with somebody at the time that we were trying to give some kind of title to what it is that real dialogue is dealing with. So dialogue therapy deals with couples. What does real dialogue deal with? And we came up with a lot of ideas. I was at first using the song from Leonard Cohen that's called Different Sides. And he says in the song, we find ourselves on different sides of a line that nobody drew. While it might be one in the higher I, down here where we live, it is two. And then he talks about how in his song, it's a man and a woman. They don't agree about anything. She says she wants to do this. The man says he wants to do that. She says, this is what suffering is. And he says, no, this is what suffering is. And so, the song is really about not agreeing, different sides. But I like the idea that we all find ourselves. And when I mean find, we discover ourselves, we investigate ourselves, as well as we're caught in different sides of a line that nobody drew. We would like to be one. We would like to feel that oneness, that's part of the love, the harmony, the higher I. But where we live is two. It has these opposing sides. And so that's how we came. I wanted to call it real dialogue for different sides. Other people felt like that word different was too vague. And we came up with opposing sides for, the title of it, just like this is what real dialogue is.
Yeah, and I think, this is an example, I think, of something that would be important to articulate in the storyline of this in DEI work, because it is gradations of difference, I think, that make the core value of DEI work in this way. And particularly when we look at, again, some of the contexts that have mission-driven values. You know, I've worked a lot with Quaker environments. There are many others to consider in this way, and even within mindful communities.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that
it's
this
public education now has
yeah,
very high
and
mission
how
driven
this
stuff.
gets described, because we do, especially unfortunately with the rise of things like school shootings or various things like that. And again, for younger people growing into this awareness, to counter what becomes how people position themselves, and you know, it changes throughout development about kind of where it leans in to be better to sort of stand from the opposing side. And a lot of argumentation, say in writing, is designed to teach people that you are successful when you can, you know, create an argument from the opposing side.
Right.
But this is why I say it's very important to define this so that people distinguish what about that experience can be problematic when you are trying to create transformative change and understanding,
Right.
which is often hidden.
Yes, yes. And I think the thing is, you may find yourself in opposition to somebody else from, it could just be desires, your needs, your wants, or it can be something like you say, oppression, power, and so on. I find, at least when I facilitate real dialogue for opposing sides with two people who represent two sides of something, for example, you know, the one that I was very, very moved by was somebody who took a very strong pro-life and someone else a pro-choice, two women. And when I facilitated with a co-facilitator a long conversation between them they both worked in a public clinic, mental health clinic. What I saw was, I saw the absolute reality of each person's position. I could humanize the positions. I could see why they were caring so much, each about her own side. And they were different sides, and they never came together in the conversation. But what they did come to is a kind of feeling of love between them. I mean, they began to feel the unity of how each one cared and what the other person's experience was, and how her experience led her to this value was understandable. And that led to a tremendous gratitude, a relief, a feeling of oneness, even though they didn't agree. You know, by the end, that wasn't the point. The point wasn't to come to a resolution or an agreement. The point was to see what the person, oneself, and the other person, what is your experience on this? Why do you have this position? That was the point of the dialogue. And I would say that I had never in my life ever heard this conversation go into so much detail that I could understand both sides, you know. So that's the point, is to be able to take these opposing sides and get to the oneness without having to agree with each other, or, you know.
No. And I think it
compromise.
is the appreciation of the emergence of new truths, but also to see both the limits and where and when certain structures are useful and applied. I mean, it's sort of a sense of, like, if you think about the creation of sanctuary, or even in our sense of offering a warm cup of tea.
Yes, yes. And here, I mean, I
Those
think of
things those things
biohakamalafa.
do come, but
Yes.
they are not always, it's knowing the time and sequencing of when those structures and offers can be given fully. And that again is an appreciation, again, when we talk about the sense perceptions, but also, our skillful means of knowing the intention and discernment for our outcomes, that is also compassionate, to recognize what is enough for the time to show that there has been direct recognition that this is an authentic endeavor.
Well, I love what you just now said, because I can, for the first time, see, from the perspective of Dr. Bayo Akamalafe, and I'm a great fan, and I know you also are a fan of his work, his idea of creating sanctuary, I understand deeply as really important. I can now see that real dialogue can create sanctuary for conflict. It can create sanctuary for opposing sides, where there is a cup of tea offered on both sides, each person feeling at home by the end of it, without changing their position, without compromising, without agreeing with the other side. But there's that feeling of, we welcome the conflict, we welcome the opposing sides, that I've never seen it that way before, that there is a sanctuary created in this environment of respect and dignity about your own experience that has taken you to a certain core value, that, or even a core desire or a core belief that is different from the person that you're meeting on the other side, So that's interesting to me, to take Bayo's ideas and apply them in this environment, in this framework of real dialogue, and real dialogue in a DEI space.